All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you all for joining today. My name is Chris Lloyd. I'm Oxford Computer Group's CTO, and we're going to get started in just a minute. I still have some people trickling in, and so I'll be back with you in just a minute. My name is Chris Lloyd. I'm Oxford Computer Group CTO, and I'm joined today with a special guest, Alexander Pavlovsky, who is a Microsoft Principal Program Manager. And we're going to be talking about hybrid and cloud identity with Azure Active Directory in today's presentation. Thank you for joining. Before we kick this off and deep dive right into it, just to talk a little bit about who OCG is, or Oxford Computer Group. We are a identity-driven security consultancy. We've been a Microsoft partner for 16 or more years at this point, and we have delivered hundreds of enterprise identity, Office 365, Azure related projects. We've been Partner of the Year for many years. And then we have deep connections with the Microsoft Cloud Engineering team, which is why I have Alexander today on our webinar to talk about some exciting things happening in Azure Active Directory. And before I get started, there is one poll that I'd like to kick off to ask: does your organization use Active Directory federated services for its application, for your single sign-on to your applications? So would love for you guys to answer that poll. Just trying to get we're trying to level set. I know there's a bunch of different identity providers out there. ADFS is just one of them, but it looks like, and I was hedging my bets. I was guessing that many of you would use it, and that's definitely the case here. So I'm going to close that poll. And I think it's important to start out these sessions when we talk about changing to a different identity provider, what the trends that we're seeing. So Oxford Computer Group has done many of different transitions to different to Azure Active Directory as the identity provider, and it's important to identify what organizations want to see when they are talking about single sign-on to applications. And first and foremost is the user experience. So single sign-on, obviously, big check in the box, want users to be able to access their applications seamlessly and not have to go through multiple different usernames and passwords, right? And then the second is, well, how will they get to these applications? So a user portal to actually get to those applications is a big ask that we see out there in the enterprise today. Security, not to say that it comes second to user experience, but it is equally as important that we have the ability to enforce conditional access, examining the devices that the users are accessing these applications on, challenging them with multi-factor authentication, with the eventual goal of moving to a password-less authentication in the future, and then protection against password spray attacks, to limit the end user interruption from locked accounts. And last but not least is the administration of these single sign-on platforms. Need a fast deployment so we can get a quick ROI on the investment that's been made. The last one is identity as a service. So that seems to be a big thing for enterprises and organizations today. I wanted to, I'm not going to talk about any identity provider specifically, but obviously I've already tipped my hand and talked about ADFS with the poll question, but that's because we see many organizations that are leveraging Office 365 are already using ADFS for single sign-on. But I wanted to step back and take a look at what an identity provider or an IDP already is, and this is the trusted system that authenticates users and provides the claims, essentially, to other digital resources, which would be, SaaS apps or internal apps that can handle those claims. And this is usually referred to as federated authentication. And so in an organization, you're going to have a whole host of applications. I've listed some SaaS applications today, and a user will attempt to access that cloud application. And this is usually referred to as a SP initiated session, where I'm going to the cloud application first. That cloud application will then redirect to my identity provider so that it will perform the authentication. This is usually done with a username or password. It can also be done with a known device or certificates. And then the IDP will then return the accepted or rejected response in an assertion token back to the SaaS application. There is also additional information that it may provide to that SaaS application. It may even be passing back a role to say this is what access that user has in that application. But that's usually done in a assertion or a token provided by the IDP. And so specifically, we're going to be talking about that IDP becoming Azure Active Directory. We can uplift applications that either are currently single sign-on with ADFS or other identity providers that you may have in your organization. We can do those quickly. We're going to look at a demo later to show how easy that can be. And how you can do some inventory of your Active Directory federated services current setup to see which applications can be moved quickly and which ones might take a little bit more time. We're also interested in the increased security that Azure AD provides. So Microsoft has done a lot of investment in bringing all sorts of different security components into Azure Active Directory. Essentially, and this has been probably used to a bit of ad nauseum to us in the industry, but essentially this makes Azure Active Directory the control plane for your identities and what those identities are going to be accessing. So the more we get to leverage Azure Active Directory as that control plane, the more organizations will be able to take benefit to the security pieces that are being put in place there. Things like MFA, passwordless sign-on, the conditional access. There's even a cloud application security broker integration, and also some analytics, machine learning through identity risk and evaluation. This is also going to enable organizations to adopt modern standards at a faster pace. So using things like OpenID Connect, and I'm not sure if I consider SAML modern, but it is still more modern than some of the things that currently exist in the enterprise today. We're able to provide a better user experience through integrations with Office 365 and portals that users are already leveraging. And then there's even the ability to provision to a certain list of applications that are using SCIM. And I try to go out of my way to explain all of the acronyms that I throw up on the board. So if you're not familiar with SCIM, it's the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. Essentially, it's a protocol that SaaS applications have adopted that allow for the provisioning of new user accounts into those applications. The great news for Office 365 customers who want to leverage Azure AD for single sign-on is that you already have the plumbing there to do this. It's very simple. If you're already using Office 365, you have Azure Active Directory in the background that's enabling all of those services, and we can just bring applications to Azure AD to leverage the identities that you already have there. The last is the ability to enable guest access to applications without having to provision them an account on premise. So we can increase the security posture by not having guest accounts have network access or over privileged accounts for what their intended purpose is. And I'm going to pass it over to Alex to talk about all the work that Microsoft has done with all the different protocols for apps?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have a number of protocols that we support for single sign-on in Azure Active Directory. And it's important to understand what is possible so that you can evaluate these applications for the feasibility of moving those to Azure Active Directory. For the single sign-on, and completely agree with Chris, modern authentication does not exactly imply SAML, but it is a better authentication mechanism than legacy methods that are available today. So SAML 2-based integrations, this means that you would set up a service provider relationship, and this is how typical SaaS solutions, the majority of SaaS solutions, I would say, still work today. So if you look at things like Salesforce, things like Dropbox, ServiceNow, and some of the other applications that you may want to get SSO with, those are all based on SAML 2-based integrations. We support legacy federations as well with things like WSFed, and of course the newer protocols such as OpenID Connect and a number of various OAuth 2 scenarios and flows. So these are the single sign-on types for the applications that you could integrate with Azure Active Directory out of the box without having to do custom work. On the provisioning front, we support SCIM2 provisioning protocol. We have a number of applications in Azure Active Directory that are already pre-integrated to use SCIM2. And if you have any other providers, we could either add them to our capabilities as a native mechanism to provision, or you could just use the standard protocol definitions to implement that in Azure Active Directory. We also support legacy SSO mechanisms for adding applications. So this would mean things like password vaulting. And for password vaulting, you would look at applications that are currently using things like forms-based authentication. And when you integrate an application with Azure Active Directory that uses forms-based authentication, if for whatever reason that application cannot be moved to use modern or federated SSO mechanisms, you could allow your users to essentially set the password for that application initially, and upon next access, they do not have to enter that password. It'll provide SSO. So you can still apply benefits of things like conditional access, but then attach some of these legacy applications to Azure Active Directory. We also have a way to give SSO with Kerberos for your on-premises applications. We have a component in Azure Active Directory for applications called Application Proxy. Application Proxy is able to authenticate the user with Azure Active Directory, apply any of the policies that you choose to apply to that sign-in, and then delegate sign-in to an on-premises application using Kerberos, provided that that application is web-based and is attached to Azure Active Directory as an App Proxy application. And also headers-based applications. So applications that use a little bit newer mechanism than forms or Kerberos, but at the same time, they do not use standards-based federated SSO. Azure Active Directory could inject headers and let the users access these applications as well. I think Chris has a demo that he would like to show us after I speak a little bit about this application gallery concept. So application gallery is a concept in Azure Active Directory where we as Microsoft work with various SaaS providers to create templates allowing you to easily add these applications to your Azure Active Directory and allow your users to access those applications in a federated way. So there's over 3,000 applications that are pre-configured. Applications are being added on a daily basis. We have a team of people working with vendors to specifically understand the parameters of the integrations so that you don't have to work with vendors and understand those parameters. As part of adding an application to the gallery, we don't only add the template, we also add the walkthroughs and guides in our application integration documentation that allow you to very easily configure both sides of the integration, not only clicking on an app to add it from a gallery, but also configuring the service provider itself to understand Azure Active Directory and sign in users with your tenant. In addition to the application gallery, you are always welcome to bring your own applications. So if something is not in the gallery, you are always able to configure that application, whether it be a SAML-based app or OpenID Connect or OAuth.
Yeah, And so I've got a demo here to kind of show that off, really showing off how easy it is to handle that scenario. So I'm in my Azure Active Directory. I've clicked on the Enterprise Applications pane or blade within Azure here, and I get the option to add a new application. I'll also see all the existing applications that exist. If you want to correlate this to what you would see in ADFS, these are going to be essentially your relying party trusts. But I'll click on new application here. It's going to bring up the gallery, and it's going to, they've segmented them off into different buckets of what the application primary purpose is. I can always search for it in here, so I'll just bring up Salesforce because that's my favorite one to pick on because everybody has Salesforce. And so I'll click on Salesforce, and it'll tell me a little bit about the app. It's going to say, well, what single sign-on mode is supported, and in this one I can do password-based single sign-on, or I can do SAML-based sign-on. Most organizations do SAML-based sign-on when available. There is one thing that I wanted to touch on before I click the add button there about the password-based sign-on. It's, you know, as Alex had mentioned, it's really those applications that don't have any federation or modern way to authenticate into them. But there is also some interesting use cases around shared accounts. And when we say shared accounts, obviously everybody in the identity management space is sitting there going, oh, I don't want to do shared accounts, but sometimes it does need to exist, and specifically when we're looking at social media accounts. So many organizations have a social media team and they're all sharing the same Twitter account. Well, if I can set this up on the back end to be an application that they access through Azure Active Directory, I can, as an administrator, set up that application with the username and password already pre-populated for that user and assign the application to that user. That user will never end up knowing the actual password to that social media platform, which essentially becomes the face of your company. So when that user leaves, they will no longer have the credentials for that social media platform.
And just one more thing to add on that, Chris, is on top of this, Azure Active Directory can actually rotate that password periodically for social media such as Twitter and Facebook. So not only do the users not know what the password is, that also you could choose a rotation schedule so that the password is continuously changed.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll click add here, and that's going to add the application to my Azure Active Directory application list here. And then once that's complete, it'll bring up the settings page for me to go and configure that application. And it will also contain the guide. So it'll have links to the guide that will enable me to really go through and set this up. So to do that, I'm going to get all sorts of different details about this application, but I'm going to start by clicking on single sign-on, which is underneath the manage section here. And here's where I have my choices on how to configure that. As I said, we talked about password-based. We're going to look at SAML. There is the concept of a linked single sign-on platform, which is where you could use ADFS, but we're really trying to get organizations to use, you know, one of the SAML or the password based, because we can really leverage your identity as a service provider, Azure Active Directory, to perform these claim actions. So if I click on SAML, I'm going to get up exactly what I would expect that I would need to configure if you've spent any time configuring applications in ADFS or any other identity provider. So I'm going to have all sorts of stuff that I need to fill out here that are going to be provided to me by Salesforce to help me out. There's this configuration guide right up at the top. So I'll click that. It's going to open me up in a new browser window. It's going to walk me through what I need to do in Azure Active Directory, which I've already done some of this, right? Because that's how I got there. And then I'm going to have to go over into Salesforce eventually and go through their single sign-on settings, which is what's going to give me the elements that are going to need to be plugged back in to Azure Active Directory. And so it's going to walk me through exactly what needs to happen in Salesforce. So I've got both sides of the guide here. It's not dropping you off and saying, okay, do this in Azure Active Directory and you probably need these vague elements from Salesforce. It's going to walk you through exactly how to configure that within Salesforce. As far as the claims, so if you've ever written ADFS claim rule language, you'll be happy to know it's much cleaner on this side. So if I need to adjust what attributes I'm sending within the claim to a SaaS application, I can change the attributes around here, and I can also do transformations. And so I can transform different attributes as to what they should be, how they should be presented to Salesforce in this case. If there's any attribute that you don't have that you need to provide to a SaaS-based application, you kind of have to start back in Active Directory on-premise and configure Azure Active Directory Connect to upload additional attributes that you may need in your claims. Most applications don't have to go down to that level. Most of them are just using an email address, and they might have name information that already exists in Azure Active Directory. So it's really just as simple as that. Once you've configured that, then you go through a change management process where you're going to go live with this this new single sign-on setting, and you'll have users accessing it through Azure AD authentication. So as Alexander had mentioned, one of the ways that we can take legacy applications or applications that are still using Kerberos and deploy them using Azure Active Directory as the identity provider is to use the Azure App Proxy. It's an on-premise connector that's going to connect to the cloud service, and it's really going to act a lot like a proxy when we talk about application proxy. The only difference, in the implementation is that it really leverages Azure Active Directory as the control mechanism to get users into the application. So it can be deployed, they can be load balanced and scaled, and you can have multiple different sets for different applications. And it's a great mechanism to bring legacy Kerberos-based applications into this control plane.
One of the really cools about application proxy is the fact that it does not require inbound connectivity to your network. So all of the communication between the connectors for App Proxy that you deploy, and those connectors are very lightweight. They're essentially network routers that run as a service on any Windows server. And those connect outbound to Azure Active Directory service called the service bus. And then when the user connects to the App Proxy endpoint, they put something onto that service bus, and the connector picks it up from there. So for you, in terms of getting firewall rules and things like that, all you need is outbound HTTPS connectivity to Azure Active Directory from your connector servers. It's very simple to deploy.
Thank you. And from the end user experience, it's really logging into myapps.microsoft.com. This is a great place to send users to see all the applications that they have been assigned to, how they can get access to those. They can also equally pin those applications to the Office 365 waffle, which is the square-based icon, which is in the upper left-hand corner of any Office 365 web-based application. And this is really a great mechanism to present end users a place to launch all their applications. Many applications, though, have a mechanism to do what I referred to as a service provider initiated logon. So if you take Salesforce, for instance, and if the user goes directly to Salesforce, plugs in their email address, it'll redirect them right back into the Microsoft authentication for that federated login. But I find much more success and much more user adoption when you do present the myapps.microsoft.com portal to the end users, because they're very excited to have a place where they can go launch their apps and get to everything that they need to do their job. And so how do we manage application access? How do we get those icons to display to the correct users in that portal? And those are all done via group memberships. So when we think of Azure Active Directory and leveraging its features, it has the ability to create dynamic groups, which is groups based on a rule. So all users where the department is sales. And then we basically attach that group to the application and say anybody who's in this group will get access to that application, thereby presenting that user on their My Apps page with a Salesforce icon. And that it's as simple as that. Additionally, those groups could come from on-premise Active Directory. If you have synced those groups up and you've got some other system managing those group memberships, you can attach those groups. You can also directly assign users to the application. But we find in most large-scale organizations with hundreds or even a smaller list of applications, it's much easier to manage that based upon security groups and definitely based upon dynamic security groups where criteria has been established that dictates if a user should get that application. Outbound provisioning also exists for SCIM-aware applications. We can automatically provision user accounts. So this, in the same nature, we've created a group. And the group is populating based upon a rule. If the application is SCIM enabled, we can outbound provision to that application based upon when that user joins that group. It works the same as in inverse. If the user gets removed from that group or the user becomes terminated, we will then remove that user from that application or disable the user depending on the business requirements and how you configure it to handle provisioning. So this is the big one, and this is why most organizations look at Azure Active Directory is to do multi-factor authentication that's seamless across all their applications that they're bringing into Azure Active Directory. We have phone and text message available, but as we work with organizations, we try to stress that the mobile application is the way to go because of the inherent security flaws within phone and text messages for multi-factor authentication. It's very easy to register users for this, and you can also get to the point where you're going to do passwordless sign-in. So you can configure Azure Active Directory to do passwordless authentication, where the user just goes to the portal, the Microsoft login portal. They type in the username, and then they hit next, and then they'll be presented with the challenge that you see on the screen displayed right here. Conditional access goes hand in hand with multi-factor authentication because this is where we can be selective as to how we enforce multi-factor authentication or blocking access to an app or allowing access to an app. We even can go one step further with some apps where we will actually control certain elements of the session depending on how they access the application. But for the most of the applications that you would be doing conditional access on, we can evaluate the user, obviously, and the device that they're accessing that application with, and then how they are actually accessing that application, whether it's through a web client or a rich client or a mobile client. And we can also look at the location, so the IP address that the request originated from. We're starting to recommend less and less of that because of organizations adopting a zero trust model in their network, where we should treat all traffic very similarly with the same scrutiny as we would outside versus inside. This is coming down to the perimeter is really changing so that the internal of the organization's network is not as trusted as it once was. But it allows us to conditional access allows us to have that visibility as well as enforcement of users accessing these applications. The last one is a risk, and so with Azure Active Directory P2. This is EMS E5. There is Azure Identity Protection, which basically allows Microsoft, Microsoft has made an investment in looking at how all of its identities are either compromised or accessing in various malicious ways, and evaluating user risk at scale. So they're able to, this actually came from the Xbox Live side of the house. And so things like impossible travel or compromised credentials that they've found on purchased blacklists, and all sorts of different events that they're able to analyze and then correlate and then determine whether or not the user should be allowed to access the application based on those data sensors.
Just to really quickly add to what Chris was saying here, as you can imagine, we process a very large number of authentication attempts, and we have a very good pulse on good, bad, and ugly, so we can actually predict the score of the sign-in fairly well by taking that data from our consumer services and other Azure Active Directory tenants and consolidating that and giving you and extending that security to your tenant as well.
And the last one, which is fairly new, is the session control with Microsoft Cloud Application Security. So if you've been, we've actually been building upon what we started with, right? We started back with Azure Active Directory, bringing the application into Azure Active Directory for federated sign-on. We've been slowly building upon the story here with adding additional security features to these applications. So we're trying to paint a story here about how the benefits, once you do that, what types of options you have for different use cases that may exist. And one of them is with Microsoft Cloud Application Security. And Microsoft has done a lot of work with a set series of applications. I tried to capture every single image of the companies that are the SaaS-based applications that align with this currently, and more are being added. But this is the ability to basically leverage cloud application security to restrict different activities inside of these applications. We're able to basically analyze what the users have been done, what they're doing in these applications, and enforce different policies on these applications. Let's say you don't want to have the ability to download when somebody is on a machine that we don't recognize. We want to say that they can access that application if it's on a machine that we don't recognize, but we do not want them to be able to download files onto that machine. So an example of that, and this really builds upon the first step of this process, is to get that application within Azure Active Directory, either federated or one of the other mechanisms that Alexander had mentioned. But once we have that, then we can build upon it and leverage more of the offerings that Microsoft has to bring protection and security controls to these applications. I think I'll pass this one over to Alexander, because they've done quite a bit of work in bringing new features to Azure AD in the identity provider space.
Yeah, so Azure Active Directory is a cloud service, and as such, it is an evergreen service. So what that really means is that we never really stop enhancing, improving the service and adding capabilities to it. There is ongoing development work that goes on to bring those new capabilities to you. So there's a handful of new things that have recently launched on the single sign-on front. First, we've launched a new single sign-on management user interface, and you've seen a glimpse of that as Chris was walking you through the demo. As part of that interface, we've given you the ability to bring your own signing certificate so that you could specify which signing certificate you'll use for your SAML integrations, as well as the ability to encrypt SAML token insertions. We have given you a nice and easy user interface to transform claim issuance rules. And again, you've seen a glimpse of that in the demo. You can really define on what to do with attributes. You can combine attributes, extract data, add data so that you can issue claims the way the application expects those claims to be seen. Again, those are the investments that are directly aimed at helping you move off of other identity providers, such as ADFS, onto Azure Active Directory as the IDP. One of the things we have available as well in Azure AD SSO, which may be of interest to many of you, is the ability to do SSO with Amazon Web Services. So AWS administration supports SAML-based SSO, and you were able to actually add Amazon Web Services from the application gallery in Azure Active Directory, just like Chris showed you. You can add Salesforce. One interesting thing that we have in AWS is that, obviously the roles for these administrators are defined within AWS itself. So Azure Active Directory has an integration point where we can go and pull those roles from Amazon Web Services and bring those roles in to Azure Active Directory, which then allows you to do things like assign roles in AWS based on group membership in Azure Active Directory. Right, so it kind of extends the single sign-on scenario a little bit beyond that, where you can now also control, as the users sign in, what roles they hold in AWS, rather than having to permanently assign roles to these users. Other things we've shipped recently, not necessarily dealing with SSO, but we do have a password protection component now, which allows you to leverage Azure Active Directory knowledge and all of the data that we get based on the attack patterns that we see, and this is specifically for password spray, right? So we have a very good definition of what a bad password looks like in real time. Again, because we are a subject to a number of password spray attacks. So we detect an attack to be password spray, we harvest the passwords that are being used to try to compromise organizations, and then we include those dynamically into a banned password list. So once you turn that on, your users won't be able to pick any of the passwords that we see as commonly abused and used in password spray attacks, even if that list is changing. On top of this, we'll let you define your own list of passwords or words that would be disallowed in passwords, with some clever logic to, for all the common replacements of, O is a 0 and S is a $sign, etc. And beyond all of this, you can now turn that on and extend this protection to your on-premises environment. So you can configure something in Azure Active Directory with your banned password list, combined with the Microsoft real-time banned password list, and extend that through a password filter to your on-premises environment, which will ultimately allow you to gain better security and prevent your users from picking bad passwords. We've recently introduced headers-based authentication, which again allows you to complete some of those on-premises scenarios with application proxy that are not Kerberos-based. And we do have something called the ADFS to Azure Active Directory migration tool that is available. You can see the link here in the presentation. This tool runs against your ADFS server and collects the inventory of the relying parties that you have set up, and gives you a total number of applications that can't be migrated for whatever reason, warnings, and of course the green marks for apps that can be moved. In addition to this, you see quite a bit of data around why. So if there are custom claims issuance rules that you need to address, those would be outlined and listed in the report as well. If there are any blocking scenarios where your application is going out and grabbing data from non-Active Directory stores, those will be called out as well. But it'll give you a good understanding of things that can be very easily moved from ADFS to Azure Active Directory in terms of SSO, as well as an understanding of some of the remediation work that you may need to do to complete that process. In addition, I'd like to mention that we encourage you to look at moving your applications to Azure Active Directory, even if they're not on ADFS. So commonly, you may use other identity providers on premises. As you can see, there are quite a few benefits to moving apps to Azure Active Directory, especially the security controls that you can apply. So take a look at that as well. Lastly, I'd like to add is that we're actually working on a new capability, which you will see very soon in Azure Active Directory, which will automatically inventory ADFS apps and will give you a similar report without having you to run tools against your ADFS environment. And this will be achieved via the integration with something called Azure Active Directory Connect Health and the ADFS agent. So keep an eye out for that preview that should be available shortly.
Thank you. And that tool, the ADFS Azure AD migration tool that's listed with that website address there, that's only that screenshot there is a small portion of the data that reports back to you. So just I do not have enough slides or enough time to actually show how much stuff that does pull back. Even if you're not interested in my
ADFS, which we hope you are. we hope that you know, you would look at that tool, because it's actually quite interesting. So where do you start, right? So we've shown all the reasons why you should be leveraging Azure AD, and we have to give you a plan of action, right? Where do you start with all of this? Well, we just talked about inventorying your existing IDP. We've obviously got an ADFS tool, but you know, other IDPs have different ways to do that, even if it's just as simple as going through and manually looking at that. Next is to come back to the business and actually prioritize that application list. So just doing some rationalization, which ones can be moved easily, which ones are going to take a little bit more work, and kind of you can do these in sprints, essentially, if we wanted to break it down to project management terms. Dev systems, so many systems have either a dev or a sandbox. These are great systems to test the configuration changes and figuring out the impact to certain user population groups. And then we get back to the change management process to prepare the users for change. And then we can do a per application migration to Azure AD. This is not a do it once and you're done. The organizations continue to onboard applications at a cyclical rate, and so this is going to be essentially a company culture shift, and it should be. Each application should be evaluated to say, does this work with Azure AD? Does it work with its authentication methods, SAML, OpenID Connect? And that should be part of an organization's application onboarding strategy, because this will continue to need to be done within the organization. But initially, these are the great starting points on how to start. And before I move on to the last wrap-up slide here, I wanted to ask one more poll question. I've got two more. I got one at the end here. And I wanted to kind of take your pulse on if you wanted to move applications to Azure AD. We're basically asking for direct feedback here on whether we made a good pitch or not. All right. Well, thank you for responding back to that poll. I think we did a decent job. And the last, oops, I have, sorry, one more slide here with lessons learned from the field. So just as you know, kind of to leave you with some things that we've experienced as we've done this. I've worked with multiple organizations, and I've got one organization in particular that I can think of where we moved about 400, 300 to 400 different applications over to Azure Active Directory. And in looking back at these different projects that our organization has been on with our customers, we've learned that not all applications are created equal. Many have different variances that you have to accommodate for, but we were able to work around most of them, and especially with the work that Microsoft is doing to continue to enhance and do development on their product, that has enabled us to bring these capabilities to those applications. Another thing that I'm going to kind of, this is one of those things that annoys me a bit, but terminology around the SAML specification is not standardized. Many SaaS providers will refer to things differently. So we think about things like the assertion consumer service, that's always named something differently. And so it's while the SAML spec is standardized, the terminology around it and what's been adopted out there in the real world is not always standard. Some applications do charge an extra service to be enabled for single sign-on, just something to keep in mind as for budgetary concerns. And then application inventories are invaluable. Understanding what applications exist in the organization is a big project. Microsoft does have a product called, it's bundled with the Cloud Application Security piece. I'm sorry, yes, Microsoft Cloud Application Security has a discovery component with it that can make inventorying the apps that are in use in your enterprise a much easier task. The last poll that I wanted to do before we close out today, I wanted to know if you are interested in learning more about how to move your applications to Azure Active Directory. Thank you for answering my 3 polls and listening to both Alexander and myself. And if you have any additional questions, please reach out to us. We have also email, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. But thank you for taking time, and thank you to Alexander for taking time out of his day to come talk with us.
Of course, thank you, everyone. And Chris, a couple of things. We do have 2 questions in our chat. I've already answered them there. I'd like to address them for the listening audience as well. So one was, is it a recommended best practice to move SSO applications from ADFS to Azure Active Directory? And it is absolutely the direction that from Microsoft to have you move from ADFS to Azure Active Directory for application SSO. We believe that the value of the security that you get with all of the features that we've discussed today and more is quite significant. And our long-term investment is to improve the SSO scenarios in Azure Active Directory and continue to enhance those and have less focus on ADFS as the identity provider. Now, having said that, ADFS is not going anywhere, but at the same time, we'd like for you to begin considering moving to Azure Active Directory as the identity provider, and not only from ADFS, but from other IDPs as well. The second question was if it's possible to customize the My Apps portal URL. The answer is it is not possible to actually customize what the URL looks like. It's a shared service that is basically myapps.microsoft.com. In scenarios where you'd like to use a different URL to get users there, you can do things like URL shorteners or your own DNS aliases to essentially send the users to the right URL by the URL that they've typed in. So it's possible, but not something that we can do out of the box.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Alexander. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.